My name is Aidan Hartley, and I'm 29 years old. What I'm about to share happened in the Sam Houston National Forest, roughly 50 miles north of Houston, Texas, where towering pines loom over winding roads and the humid air can feel like a living thing watching your every move. I still have nightmares about that trip. Some nights I can't sleep without waking in a cold sweat. Even after all this time, I question whether I'll ever truly escape that forest and the horrors that lurk there. I'd planned the trip with 3 of my closest friends: Drew Parker, who is 31, Sophia Marquez, 28, and Kevin, right 30. We'd talked about getting out of the city for weeks. Drew was always the adventure seeker among us, but ironically it was me, ever the methodical planner, who suggested Sam Houston. I read about its secluded trails, the tranquil ponds, the miles of ancient forest. Besides, I wanted a break from the everyday stress of my job in IT support. Kevin worked construction and had just finished a grueling project. Sophia, who was teaching grade school, was exhausted from back-to-back parent conferences. Drew, a personal trainer, had a flexible schedule and thirsted for the outdoors. We thought a weekend escape would be the perfect remedy for all our frustrations. We piled into my old RV early on a Saturday morning. My dad bought that RV years ago, passed it down to me when he finally decided he was too old for cross-country road trips. Despite my best attempts at maintenance, the thing had an attitude. The generator would sputter unpredictably, the water heater was temperamental, and there was a persistent battery drain I could never trace. Still, it was big enough to sleep for, and we all convinced ourselves it would hold out for a few nights. The sense of freedom outweighed any concerns about mechanical hiccups. The drive to Sam Houston National Forest felt ordinary enough at first. The tension in the cabin was mild, mostly Kevin complaining that we should have rented something newer. Drew kept flipping through the radio stations hoping to find classic rock, and Sophia typed away on her phone, checking last-minute camping tips. We finally passed a battered sign announcing we were entering the forest territory. The thick canopy of pines and hardwoods soon engulfed our view. We spotted only a few hikers' cars parked near some trailheads, but otherwise the area seemed unusually quiet, as if the forest itself was waiting. We stopped at a ranger station, a squat, rustic building with a single truck parked out front. A man named Ranger Blake Henderson came out to greet us. He was in his 40s, stocky build, tan uniform. He gave us an odd, reserved smile when Drew bragged about wanting to find the wildest trails where no one else goes. Ranger Blake didn't quite discourage us, but he did mention staying on marked paths and cautioned us that people occasionally got lost if they wandered too far. He said it in a way that implied more than just standard caution, his eyes flicking over the old RV, then back to us like he was sizing up how prepared we really were. Before we pulled away, he gave us a look that lingered a second too long. Something in his gaze told me that these woods had secrets, ones he wasn't sure we could handle. Regardless, the first day went smoothly enough. We found a decent campsite off one of the secondary roads. The area was mostly empty, so we had our pick of spots. The nearest official campground with hookups was about 2 miles away, but we wanted something more isolated. The site we settled on had a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, the needles forming a soft mat underfoot. We set up a simple ring of stones for a fire pit and parked the RV so that its door faced the clearing. I remember stepping out and inhaling the fresh air, noticing how the humid scent of pine needles mixed with the murk of the forest. For a fleeting moment, I felt an almost unsettling calm, the hush that precedes a storm. That afternoon, we went on a short walk around the perimeter. Drew kept sprinting ahead, calling back for us to hurry up. I noticed scratch marks on several tree trunks, arranged in strange patterns. At first glance, they looked like claw marks from an animal, but the lines were too evenly spaced. Sophia pointed one set out, brushing her fingers against the grooves. She frowned, but she couldn't determine if it was natural or man-made. Kevin shrugged, attributing them to teenage vandalism. It gave me a mild chill, but I said nothing. I didn't want to ruin the group's enthusiasm over what might have been a harmless curiosity. Night descended quickly. The 4 of us built a small fire, roasted hot dogs, told stories, and shared some beers. The conversation eventually turned to cryptids, ghost stories, and local legends of missing campers. Sophia told a tale she'd heard from her grandfather, something about shapeshifters or evil spirits that roamed the southwestern forests, luring travelers away. Drew found it thrilling. Kevin rolled his eyes, and I tried to hide that the story made me uneasy. After all, real wildlife could pose a danger, but shape-shifting monsters, that was the stuff of nightmares, not everyday life. Even so, every so often I thought I spotted movements beyond the glow of the campfire, shapes shifting just out of sight. I blamed it on my imagination and the flickering shadows. Sometime around midnight, a nerve-rattling shriek pierced the silence. It echoed through the trees, a cross between a woman's wail and an animal in agony. We jerked upright, hearts hammering. Kevin's eyes went wide as he flashed our single heavy-duty flashlight into the dark. We saw nothing but moving silhouettes of branches. Drew tried to shrug it off as a coyote or bobcat, something we city dwellers weren't used to hearing. Yet that explanation did nothing to ease the tightness in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd just been singled out by the forest. When dawn broke, I stepped out of the RV with a slight headache from the beers. I was hoping the crisp morning air would clear my head, but as soon as I circled the vehicle, my stomach twisted. The dirt around our campsite had footprints, long, narrow prints that almost looked human, but the toe shapes were elongated and they sunk deep. It was as though whoever or whatever had circled our RV walked with an unnatural gait. Several pine needles were brushed aside, forming a distinct path around the site. My mind raced with rational explanations. Maybe a ranger had checked on us or a hunter passed through. But something about the spacing of the prints was off. They almost looked digitigrade, like some large animal walking partially on its toes. Quietly called Sophia over, and her face went pale. She muttered something about the stories her grandfather told, about how certain things walked at night, testing boundaries. Kevin and Drew joined us, both perplexed. Drew snapped a few photos on his phone, half joking about posting them online to see if some cryptid enthusiast recognized the pattern. We tried to laugh it off, but that morning a subtle shift occurred in the group dynamic. We grew more alert, as if the forest had opened a new dimension of threat we hadn't considered. Still, we had the day ahead, and the morning sun filtered through the pine canopy in golden shards that made the forest look almost inviting. Drew insisted we do a proper hike on a lesser-traveled trail. He was restless, itching for adventure. Kevin and I exchanged looks. Our RV was old, and I was worried about leaving it unattended for hours in the middle of nowhere. Yet Drew was persuasive, and Sophia, though uneasy, was curious to see more of the area. I ended up driving us deeper along a rough gravel road, scouting out a place to park before we hit the trail. Looking back, I wish I'd insisted we stay near a more populated campground. We finally found a clearing to leave the RV, though it was hardly a designated spot. The dirt road was rutted, branches scratching the sides of the RV like skeletal fingers. By the time we parked, the engine sounded like it was struggling. There was a faint burning smell wafting through the air vents, so I quickly shut everything off. Kevin said we should pop the hood later, see if anything was leaking, but Drew was already bounding out, backpack on, taking point. Sophia and I followed, uneasy. Kevin grumbled under his breath but came along. The trail started innocent enough, lined with pine needles and wild shrubs. But as we continued, we saw the same strange markings scratched into the bark of random trees. Some looked fresh, the sap still oozing. Others were older, almost scarred over. A sinking dread took root in me when I realized many of these marks weren't random. Some formed crude symbols, circles with spiky lines, or jagged shapes that gave me the impression of a twisted face. Every step seemed to take us deeper into a place where we didn't belong. About an hour in, we came across a fallen log blocking the path. A bizarre silence enveloped us. No birds, no scuttling animals, nothing. Sophia shivered and said it felt like the forest was holding its breath. Drew cracked a joke about Bigfoot, but his tone sounded forced. Kevin checked the time on his phone, only to see we had no reception whatsoever. Discomfort settled between us. We decided to push further just to see if the trail looped back around. Looking back, that decision was driven more by stubborn pride than any sense of logic. Eventually, after another hour or so, we decided we'd had enough. The path seemed to go on forever, and tension was building with each step. It was barely midday, but the cloud cover turned the forest dim. We trudged back the way we came. By then we felt watched, though none of us said it aloud. Occasionally branches snapped in the distance and we'd freeze, hearts pounding. It was always quiet when we tried to pinpoint the source. That unnatural hush wore down my nerves when we got back to the RV. Kevin and I lifted the hood to check on the engine. A belt was frayed, and the battery seemed weak. We fiddled with the connections, trying to reassure ourselves that it would at least start. While I was bent over the engine, Sophia gasped. I turned to see her pointing at the RV's side panel. There were fresh scratches. 5 parallel lines gouged deep into the metal as if a massive claw had raked it. My gut clenched. These weren't just random lines. They formed a near-perfect quintet of slashes, each about a foot long. I ran my hand over them, feeling the jagged edges. Drew tried to lighten the mood by joking, "At least it's a conversation piece," but no one laughed. We all piled in, hoping to drive back to the original campground where we'd spent the previous night, maybe even continue to the more public area with actual hookups. I turned the ignition. The RV coughed, the engine stuttering. I gave it some gas, prayed under my breath, and finally it roared to life, although it sounded rough. Sophia offered to help navigate, but we had to rely on old-school maps because our phones had 0 reception. The forest roads branched off in confusing ways, and at more than one fork we guessed which direction to go. By the time we realized we were backtracking incorrectly, the engine began to sputter. Then, as if summoned by our desperation, we found the path completely blocked by a large pine tree that had fallen across the road. Its trunk was thick, the branches stretching across any possible detour. We stopped awestruck at the improbability of it. That tree hadn't been there earlier. Even if it had just fallen by chance, the timing felt like more than coincidence. We got out to move smaller branches, trying to make enough space for the RV to squeeze around. Our progress was slow, each of us yanking and snapping limbs. The undergrowth was thick, interwoven. We started to sweat in the muggy heat. The entire time I felt eyes on us, prickling the back of my neck. Halfway through clearing a path, we heard a low growl from the trees. It was deep, vibrating in the air like a large predator warning us off. I saw Drew's eyes dart nervously. Kevin clutched a hatchet we'd been using to chop branches. Sophia whispered that we should leave the tree, go back to the campsite and wait for daylight or for someone to come along. Her voice trembled. Nobody argued. We retreated to the RV, the road still blocked, our hearts pounding as we piled back inside and locked the doors. Night crept in earlier than we expected. The dense forest can make 6 o'clock feel like twilight. We lit a lantern, rummaged for anything that could serve as a weapon. We found a hunting knife, the hatchet, and a crowbar. Not much against a large predator, let alone something more unnatural. The air grew thick with anxiety as we debated what to do next. Kevin tried turning on the generator, hoping to power some lights and possibly the air conditioning, but it sputtered once and died. He cursed, tried again, and got nothing. The battery was also draining fast. Our overhead lights were dim. It was a matter of time before we'd be in complete darkness. That was when the pounding on the RV began. A single, forceful thud against the side, making the entire vehicle shake. Sophia screamed. I leapt up, throwing open the curtain of one window. The outside lamp was too weak to see more than a few feet into the darkness. Drew yanked the door open against my protests and aimed a flashlight into the night. For a split second, I caught sight of something at the edge of the beam. A tall, gangly silhouette, too elongated to be human, retreating into the underbrush. The flashlight glinted off pale flesh. Then it was gone. Drew slammed the door, breathing fast. His face had drained of color. Kevin was shouting questions, but none of us had coherent answers. My own mind was reeling. Had I really seen that shape? Part of me wanted to believe it was just a trick of the light, but the primal terror clenching my gut told me otherwise. We could still feel it outside. Every now and then, faint scratching on the metal echoed through the silence. Drew barked at it, something like a challenge, and the scratching stopped, only to start on the other side of the vehicle. We barely slept that night. Sophia prayed softly at one point, crossing herself and muttering words in Spanish. Kevin huddled with the crowbar, refusing to let it out of his grip. Drew paced back and forth, a ball of restless adrenaline. I tried to keep calm, but every sense felt raw, like I was waiting for something to burst through the windows. The night seemed endless, and the forest outside was as still as death, except for the creeping presence that circled us. Somehow we survived until morning without a direct attack. Exhausted, we peered outside at first light. My heart sank at what we saw. Deeper gouges in the RV's side, footprints in the mud that circled around to the front, and a foul smell lingering in the air, like rotten eggs mixed with decaying flesh. Sophia gagged when she stepped off the RV's ladder. The sense of being marked or stalked was overwhelming. We regrouped, ate a small breakfast of granola bars, and decided that our only chance was to clear that fallen tree and drive out of this place. Doing so in daylight, we hoped, would offer some small advantage, though my gut told me the thing out there might not be bothered by daylight at all. We approached the massive trunk again. Kevin and Drew started hacking at branches while Sophia and I took turns keeping watch, weapons ready. Occasionally, we'd hear branches snap in the distance or catch glimpses of something moving just beyond our periphery. Minutes ticked by with torturous slowness. At around noon, we'd managed to clear enough branches to hopefully wedge the RV around the trunk. Kevin insisted on testing the route on foot, stepping carefully over thick roots. He was about 15 feet away from us when he suddenly jerked his head to the right. I'll never forget the look on his face. He mouthed something like, "Oh God." I followed his gaze and saw it, leaning out from behind a wide pine trunk. It stood at least 7 feet tall, limbs disturbingly thin, a head that almost looked like a skull wrapped in pale, leathery skin. Two sunken eyes, black as tar, stared back at us. My breath caught in my throat. The shape was absolutely still, a predator evaluating its prey. For a moment, none of us moved. Kevin lifted the hatchet with trembling hands. Sophia gasped my name, but I was frozen. Then the creature let out a guttural hiss that reverberated through the clearing. It lurched forward in a blur of motion, crossing half the distance in what seemed like a single stride. Kevin stumbled back, swinging the hatchet wildly. The thing twisted away impossibly fast, letting out another shriek. Drew yelled, sprinting toward Kevin, and I snapped out of my daze, sprinting as well. Sophia stood guard near the tree, eyes flicking over the forest in case it circled around. We regrouped around Kevin, who was panting, pale, but uninjured. The creature vanished back into the darkness of the forest. For how long, we couldn't be sure. My heart hammered so fiercely, I thought it might burst. We realized just how real, how physical, and how dangerous this entity was. It wasn't just toying with us, it was hunting us. We decided to attempt the drive out right then. We ran back, jumped into the RV, and Kevin took the driver's seat, as he had the steadiest nerves. Drew and I kept watch by the windows, ready, with the crowbar and knife while Sophia clutched the flashlight. Kevin started the engine, pressed the gas, and we lurched forward. The RV's tires spun in the soft mud, but after a tense moment it found traction. We slowly navigated toward the tree. Kevin had to cut the wheel hard to the right, edging the RV around the trunk's thick mass. The side mirror scraped and snapped off with a crunch of plastic and metal. He kept going inch by inch. I felt the entire vehicle tilt precariously. I could have sworn I saw that pale shape flit among the trees, watching for an opening to strike. At last, we cleared the trunk, the RV wobbling back onto the road with a heavy jolt. Kevin accelerated, but not too fast. One wrong move could send us into a ditch. My hands shook as I clutched the back of his seat. I looked at the side mirror on my side, the only one left. Through it, I caught a glimpse of something sprinting, behind us, weaving through the undergrowth. For a moment, it was close enough that I could see the shape of its face, the unnatural angles of its jaw. Then we rounded a bend and the creature disappeared from sight. We kept driving for what felt like an eternity, the rough road bouncing us around. Finally, we found a more established dirt road that led us out near the ranger station. Relief flooded me as we saw the small parking lot. Ranger Blake's truck was still there. We pulled up haphazardly and all but collapsed out of the RV, shaken to our cores. The ranger stepped out of his office, took one look at our battered vehicle and our terrified faces and knew something terrible had happened. He asked us what we saw and we struggled to explain. Kevin insisted it was some kind of monster, a pale, human-like creature with claws and impossible speed. Sophia said it was a shapeshifter from Southwestern legends. Drew just paced, unable to form coherent sentences. Ranger Blake's face hardened. He quietly told us we weren't the first ones to come back from the deeper trails talking about strange sightings, missing gear, footprints that weren't quite human. He admitted that his job was to keep tourists away from areas with frequent disappearances. Usually folks just vanished without a trace. We were the lucky ones, if you could call it that. The ranger offered to guide us back to civilization. We followed him in our battered RV, staying behind his truck on the main paved roads. The ride felt surreal, the forest's tall pines still, pressing in from both sides, but at least we were on a real road that would eventually lead us home. Nobody spoke much. A hollow silence filled the RV, broken only by the rattling engine and the occasional sob from Sophia, who was trying to keep her fear in check. We reached the outskirts of the forest by late afternoon. The sight of a small convenience store on the highway felt like a miracle. Ranger Blake waved us on, telling us he'd handle any official questions about what had happened in the deeper parts of Sam Houston. We never filed a formal report describing the creature. We suspected no one would truly believe us, or we'd end up in the news as the latest crazy campers with a monster story. Besides, what would we even say that we saw something that defied logic and left us haunted? On the drive back to Houston, the four of us were silent, each lost in our thoughts. Kevin stared at the road, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Drew was uncharacteristically subdued. Sophia stared at her phone but never typed, her eyes red from tears. As for me, I kept replaying every moment in my mind. The footprints around our campsite, the scratches on the RV, that final glimpse of the pale creature running alongside the trees. I felt an overwhelming sense of guilt for suggesting Sam Houston in the first place, but I also felt some indescribable presence had targeted us the moment we set foot in the forest. We returned to our normal routines eventually, but the trip lingered like a dark cloud. Drew refused to talk about it. He claimed we beat the odds and survived, that's all that mattered. Kevin developed nightmares, waking up in cold sweats. Sophia began delving into old family stories, searching for any references to shapeshifters or forest demons. She told me once that her grandfather used to say, "When the forest wants you, it will call you by name." She wondered if that was what happened, that we'd stumbled into a place where the forest's malevolence took corporeal form. As for me, I've tried to cope by writing it all down, capturing every detail to prove to myself it was real, and though nightmares persist, though less frequently. Sometimes I'll be driving at night and a flash of movement on the side of the road will send my heart pounding. I'll think I see a lanky, pale shape lurking behind a guardrail or stepping between the trees. I grip the wheel and remind myself that I escaped that forest once. But part of me wonders if I truly got away, or if it's just waiting for me to drop my guard. Months later, I had the RV repaired enough to drive, though it still bears the scars of that encounter. 5 deep scratches along one side remain a permanent reminder. The mechanics who fixed the engine asked about them, and I just shook my head, unable to give them a coherent explanation. They teased that I must have tangled with a bear. I let them believe that. The alternative is too chilling to repeat casually. I've stayed in touch with Ranger Blake via email. Whenever I gather the courage to ask, "Has anyone else reported seeing something in the forest?" His replies are always short and vague. He'll say, "Not recently," or, "Some folks went missing, but it's unconfirmed." I sense he knows more than he's telling, that whatever roams those trees is older than any modern legend, some primal force that preys on wanderers. Maybe he's trying to keep panic down, or maybe he's protecting us by not fueling our terror with more details. I've told a few close friends about our ordeal, usually leaving out the more fantastical elements. I'll mention the footprints or the strange creature, describing it as some wild animal we couldn't identify. But I know the truth. We all do. Kevin always changes the subject if it comes up. Sophia goes quiet. And Drew tries to bury it under jokes about that crazy camping weekend. If any of us show the real fear in our eyes, we sense how fragile we are, how easily we could shatter. I still remember the sight of that creature's sunken eyes. They seemed ancient, malicious, as though it recognized we were intruders in its territory. Sometimes I'll rationalize that it was just a mutated animal, or maybe an emaciated hermit living off the land. But deep down, I know it wasn't human. No person can move that fast or emit those otherworldly shrieks that make your bones rattle. And no ordinary predator leaves symbols carved on trees in a pattern that suggests a cold, deliberate intelligence. If I learned anything from that experience, it's that the forest is far older and more mysterious than we often realize. We pave roads and mark trails, thinking we own the land, but there are corners of the wilderness that belong to something else entirely. When you wander too far, or show up uninvited, you might get a glimpse of what lurks in those hidden places. If you're very unlucky, you might not come back at all. For now, I avoid venturing into deep woods. Even local parks with their well-groomed paths make me uneasy if the sun starts to set. My friends and I have grown distant. We still talk, but not like before. There's a shadow over us, a shared secret that sets us apart from everyone else. We know what's out there, waiting beyond the safety of civilization, watching from behind the thick trunks and undergrowth. It changed us, severed our naive trust in the benign beauty of nature. Some nights, when the wind is howling and I can't sleep, I step outside my apartment and look toward the horizon. I can almost sense the forest's presence, a vast expanse of darkness that extends beyond the city lights. In those moments, I wonder if the entity we encountered remembers us as well. If it does, maybe it's waiting, patient and unbound by time, for the chance to reclaim its prey. I tell myself we survived for a reason. Maybe it was luck, or maybe it was a warning shot, an unspoken command not to come back. Part of me thinks about returning, just to see if it was real or if my mind fabricated half the details. But I'm not that brave or that foolish. The memory of that final chase down the dirt road, the creature pacing us, still sends chills coursing through my veins. In the end, we left the forest physically, but it never truly left us. Each of us carries the scars, whether visible or not. Drew covers his fear with bravado, Kevin tries to bury it under logic, and Sophia prays for peace, still feeling that intangible link to her grandfather's warnings. As for me, I write and rewrite this story, capturing every image in hopes it might exorcise my demons. But nothing banishes that memory. It sits like a splinter in my mind, whispering that we were marked from the moment we stepped beneath those ancient pines. If you ever drive north of Houston and pass that sign for Sam Houston National Forest, do yourself a favor. Stay on the main roads, keep your eyes straight ahead, and don't stray into the uncharted trails. Because if you linger too long, if you venture too deep, you might feel something watching. And if you're unlucky, you'll see it. A flash of pale, predatory shape between the trees, a guttural hiss that sends adrenaline surging, a pair of inky black eyes brimming with ancient malice. By then it may be too late to run. I wish I could say that writing this down has brought me closure. It hasn't. But at least it feels like I'm sharing a warning, a final plea to others who might be tempted by the forest's false serenity. We always talk about nature's beauty, but we rarely acknowledge its darker face, the one with claws and hollow eyes, the one that looks at us like prey, the one that can turn a simple camping trip into a lifelong nightmare. My name is Aiden Hartley, and I'm 29 years old. One ill-fated trip to Sam Houston National Forest taught me that some places are best left unexplored. Some legends are best left unchallenged, and some creatures, I fear, will never be confined to the realm of myth. My name is Jake Riverson. I'm 34 years old, and this story happened in Palo Duro Canyon just outside Amarillo, Texas. I've always considered myself practical, maybe even a little skeptical about things that go bump in the night. That changed when I drove my old RV down into that Red Rock wonderland for what I hoped would be a peaceful escape. I'd lost my job a few weeks earlier, Laid off after my corporate office went through a so-called reorganization, my self-esteem had taken a hit, and I thought that a few days in the quiet of Palo Duro would help me reset and figure out the next phase of my life. I never expected to find something else entirely, a haunting reminder that some histories refuse to stay buried. I arrived on a Thursday afternoon, the mid-May sun glazing the canyon in tones of orange and crimson. The drive down from the rim felt surreal, with steep switchbacks cutting through the rock layers. I had known Palo Duro Canyon was the second largest canyon in the United States, but I hadn't realized the sheer scale until I was there in person. The massive cliffs and hoodoos seemed to watch my every move as I navigated the winding road. A warm breeze rustled the sparse junipers and prickly pear cacti dotting the roadside. It was stunning, and for a moment, the tension I'd been carrying in my chest eased up, as if the canyon were welcoming me into its ancient embrace. I pulled into a small ranger station first, more a wooden shack than a building, to check in. A woman with silver-streaked hair and a friendly smile came outside. She wore the park host vest and introduced herself as Donna Harrington. She had a calm, maternal energy about her, the kind of person who's seen it all and tries to keep folks out of trouble. When I told her I planned to camp off the more popular loops, she hesitated. "You sure about that?" she asked. "It's been quiet out here lately, not too many visitors in the back areas. Storm season's coming too." I forced a chuckle. "I'm hoping for a bit of quiet, actually. If it gets bad, I can always move." She eyed the old RV and nodded politely, though I could sense she wasn't entirely convinced. She gave me a permit and a gentle warning not to wander off unmarked trails, especially if we got heavy rain. "The flash floods here can be nasty," she said, tapping her pen on the wooden counter. "And there are other things you want to avoid." When I asked her to clarify, she simply said, "Cliffs can be unpredictable, that's all. Stay safe, Jake." I assumed she was just doing her job. Maybe the park had had a rash of accidents. Still, her tone lingered in my mind as I got back into my RV. I found a secluded site near the base of a high cliff, a good distance from most of the tent campers. It had a fire ring and enough flat space to park. The view was striking. Tall, striated rock walls stretching into the distance with the clear sky overhead. I stepped out to unhook my small generator, noticing how quiet it was. Unlike the bustle of the city where you never really experience true silence, here I could hear my own breathing. Every footstep crunched on the dry soil and scattered rocks, echoing slightly. A hawk circled overhead, screeching. Its call vanished into the wind. I set up my minimal camp routine, pushing aside my negative thoughts about unemployment and focusing on the present. If I let the place work its magic, I might regain some peace. After a simple dinner, I stepped outside with a folding chair to watch the sky melt into pink and purple hues. I'm not sure how long I sat there, just listening to the breeze, the distant calls of birds, and once in a while the hum of my RV's generator. It felt good to be alone in a place so vast where my problems seemed smaller than the ancient rock walls around me. Night came on swiftly. The stars blinked into life overhead, and I found myself relaxing more than I had in months, until I heard it. It began as a faint whistling echoing down the canyon, a strange sort of melody. At first I thought it might be the wind brushing through cracks in the cliffs, but there was a pattern, notes rising and falling, almost like someone was playing a flute off in the distance. I stood up, scanning the darkness, but saw no flashlights, no sign of another person. The whistling would stop abruptly, then pick up again from a different direction. The hair on my arms stood on end. Eventually, I retreated into my RV, locked the door, and told myself it was nothing more than an odd canyon quirk. I went to bed later than I wanted. A kernel of unease settled in my stomach. In the morning, my battery was dangerously low, even though I'd barely used any power. The generator seemed fine, but the battery gauge read just above the red. I double-checked everything and scratched my head. Maybe the desert chill had drained it more than usual. I made a note to keep an eye on it and decided to tour more of the park. That's when I met Carlos Delgado, a fellow camper who had set up a small station with an easel and paint supplies a quarter-mile from my site. Carlos was in his early 40s, lean, with a sun-weathered face and a well-trimmed salt and pepper beard. He called out when he saw me. I ambled over, not wanting to intrude, but curious about the canvases he had propped up. Each painting captured a different hue of the canyon walls at different times of day, from blazing afternoon reds to dusky oranges. We made small talk, and he offered me a bottled water from his cooler. I asked him how long he'd been here. 2 weeks, he said. Came all the way from Oklahoma just to paint these cliffs. There's a beauty here you can't find anywhere else. I nodded. It's gorgeous, all right. I've never seen a place that changes color so quickly. I was out here last night and the rock faces seemed almost purple. He grinned, then lowered his voice. So you heard anything weird at night yet? His question took me aback. Maybe I wasn't imagining things. I told him about the whistling, and he gave me a knowing look. I've heard it too, he said. It's why I started sleeping with my truck doors locked. Could be nothing, but it gave me the creeps. He told me he'd heard rumors, stories that the ghosts of Comanche warriors sometimes roamed the canyon at night, or that old cavalry soldiers from the mid-1800s still rode phantom horses across the dusty plain. I wasn't sure whether to laugh or look worried, so I settled somewhere in between, letting out a short chuckle but feeling my face tense. Carlos shrugged. I'm not saying I believe in that stuff, but you stay in these parts long enough, you start to wonder. That afternoon I took a drive through other sections of the park. I passed one of the main camp loops, which was half empty, then continued to an overlook trail. The sun pounded the earth, warming the rocks beneath my feet. I remember pausing at the edge of a cliff, looking down at the sprawling canyon floor. A gust of wind rattled me, and I stepped back involuntarily. Down below, near a stretch of dried creek bed, something moved, a figure, or maybe an animal. Through my binoculars, I caught the briefest glimpse of motion, a tall, lean shape vanishing into the shade of the canyon walls. It was probably another camper. That was the logical thought anyway. Yet something about that fleeting moment made my pulse spike. The shape was too quick, almost gliding. I decided to return to my RV before nightfall. If I was honest with myself, a subtle anxiety had begun to gnaw at me. The dryness in my mouth wasn't just from the heat. Back at my campsite, I was greeted by the same hush as the previous evening. Nothing stirred except the sighing wind. Despite the bright sun overhead, the whole scene felt claustrophobic, the cliffs looming close. While rummaging for dinner fixings, I thought I heard hooves on gravel. I turned, expecting to see a park ranger on horseback or a local riding the trails, but there was no one, just my footprints in the dirt. I stared for a few seconds, half expecting a horse to come galloping around a bend. Nothing. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was letting Carlos's ghost stories get to me. As I fired up my little propane stove, though, the sound lingered in my mind like a distant echo of danger. At twilight, the wind picked up, whistling softly across the canyon. I decided to set up a small campfire, if only to have the comforting crackle of flames to block out the unnerving quiet. I sat there in the folding chair, stirring the embers, when a teenage girl appeared at the edge of my campsite, her hair pulled into a messy ponytail. She wore a t-shirt and jeans, her dusty sneakers telling me she'd likely come a long way. She lifted her hand in a shy greeting. "Hope I'm not intruding," she said. "I'm Trisha Martin. My dad's the caretaker of some ranch land nearby. I was out exploring." I offered her a seat, though I was curious why a teen would be out here alone. She explained that she sometimes came to Palo Duro with friends, though today she was on her own. "Weird stuff happens in this canyon," she said almost conspiratorially. "You probably heard about the Ghost Rider?" I shook my head, not wanting to admit that Carlos had already spooked me with some version of the story. "I've heard whispers," I said. Trisha leaned closer to the fire, her face flickering with the orange glow. "They say back in the old days, a Comanche warrior named Running Thunder lost his entire family during a brutal conflict with the U.S. cavalry. He was rumored to have escaped into a secret network of caves. When soldiers went after him, a flash flood wiped them all out. None survived, but some nights people claimed to see a rider on a pale horse galloping along the ridges, wailing in sorrow. If you hear his cry, that means something bad's coming. A chill coursed through me despite the heat of the flames. I forced a little smile. That's intense. She shrugged. I don't know if it's real or just a ghost story, but I had a friend go missing once for a whole night after hearing hooves. She turned up the next morning, dazed with no memory of what happened. Trisha's voice shook slightly. Then she awkwardly thanked me for the seat by the fire and left, saying she had to meet her father. Alone again, I kept staring into the fire, my thoughts swirling. Everything in me wanted to dismiss it as myth, local legend spiced up by teenage imagination. Yet I couldn't deny the strange hints I'd already encountered. That night I locked my RV tighter than I ever had before, checking every window, the battery gauge, the generator. Sleep didn't come easy. My nerves were wired, braced for the slightest sound. Around 2 a.m, I snapped awake when something thumped on the roof. The RV rocked gently. I grabbed a flashlight, heart pounding, and scrambled to the driver's seat so I could look out the windshield. No shadows or silhouettes. The wind was still. When I mustered enough courage to step outside, gripping a tire iron in my other hand, I found nothing but dust swirling under a sliver of moonlight. I'd never felt so vulnerable as I did in that moment, scanning the cliffs that rose around me like a silent audience. Come morning, I felt bleary-eyed but determined to get answers. That unsettled feeling was driving me crazy. I met Donna at the ranger station again, asked if she knew anything about Comanche legends or ghost riders. She pursed her lips, eventually admitting that local stories about restless spirits and old battles had circulated for generations. Palo Duro has a deep history, she said gently. Some tragedies leave marks that never go away. She offered more practical advice too. Watch for the weather, because a storm front was moving in. Flash floods could tear through the canyon with little warning. Grateful for the heads up, I promised to be cautious. Then I noticed something in her expression. She seemed worried about me, like she sensed I'd gotten too close to something dangerous. On my way back, I drove past Carlos's makeshift art station. He was packing up a few supplies into his truck bed. He waved me over. Jake, can you help me load these canvases? I'm heading into town for a day or two. He looked shaken, as if he'd seen a ghost. I asked if he was all right. I'm fine, he muttered. I just had a weird night. Kept hearing hooves. Thought I was going nuts. Figured it's time for a short break before I come back to finish my paintings. He tried to laugh, but it came out forced. That left me even more rattled. If Carlos was disturbed enough to leave, maybe I should too. Yet part of me felt stubborn, like packing up and fleeing would be conceding defeat, letting fear take the wheel. I'd come here to find clarity. Maybe, just maybe, facing these bizarre occurrences would help me confront the doubts that plagued my life. My own logic was shaky, but I stuck to it. Early that evening, I decided to do something bold. Follow the canyon floor toward a series of smaller caves I'd seen marked on an old map. Maybe I could prove these ghost stories were just that, stories. At least if I found nothing but empty rock formations, I could get some closure. I set out on foot with a flashlight, extra batteries, and water. A small part of me regretted it, immediately. The canyon air felt charged, static building in each gust of wind. Clouds were bunching up on the horizon, turning the sky a hazy purple. As I traversed a barely distinguishable path between rugged rock spires, the temperature dropped. Then I heard it again. The faint sound of galloping hooves. My chest tightened. I quickened my pace, scanning for a horse. Nothing. The hooves echoed off the cliffs, slipping from one side of the canyon to the other, like a ghostly game of hide and seek. But no dust kicked up, no shape materialized, just the pounding as though some invisible rider was tracking me. I pressed on, eventually reaching a pile of rubble where a cave entrance had collapsed. The old map suggested multiple chambers once existed here. Now it was just jagged boulders and smaller openings big enough to crawl into if I were feeling suicidal. A metallic taste filled my mouth as I considered the possibility of a hidden route beneath the rubble. The hair on the back, of my neck rose, warning me not to go any closer. Lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating the canyon walls for a split second. It looked like they were alive, dancing in the shadows. Suddenly, the galloping grew louder. Thunder rolled overhead. My flashlight flickered and I cursed, tapping it. In the brief darkness, I saw a shape at the edge of my vision. A large horse, with a rider perched atop, silhouetted against the bleak sky. My blood turned to ice. The rider's form was elongated, draped in what appeared to be tattered cloth or hide. I couldn't see its face, but I sensed a well of sorrow and rage emanating from it. When my flashlight came back on, the figure was gone, replaced by a swirl of dust. The wind whipped around me, carrying faint cries. They didn't sound entirely human, more like a painful wail that echoed heartbreak across centuries. I stood rooted, uncertain whether to flee or try to communicate. My rational mind screamed to run, but a flicker of empathy made me hesitate. If these were spirits linked to a tragic history, perhaps acknowledging their suffering could calm them. A flash of lightning revealed a gap in the collapsed rock. The opening was small but passable if I slid on my belly. The wind howled so loud I could barely hear my own panicked breaths. For reasons I still struggled to articulate, I crawled forward, thinking maybe I'd find some evidence of old artifacts. Instead, I found a small open chamber, half blocked by boulders. The air inside was stale, reeking of damp, ancient dirt. I shone my flashlight on the walls, revealing faint pictographs, figures on horseback, outlines of men with spears, swirling, patterns I didn't recognize. My pulse hammered. If this was once a sacred place, I was trespassing. The storm intensified, thunder rattling the rocks. I turned to see water trickling in from a crack, realized a flash flood might soon tear through here. My instincts screamed to leave. But as I started to crawl back, a deafening crack rent the air, followed by a rush of wind so strong it nearly knocked me over. The entrance caved in slightly, dust and small stones pelting me. My exit was partially blocked by slabs of rock. Terror seized me. I scrambled to clear a path, but a larger boulder wedged itself against the opening. I was trapped. Panic burst in my veins. I shouted for help, but my voice was lost in the roaring wind. Then, in the flicker of my flashlight, I saw that figure. Again, though this time it wasn't perched on a horse. It was a shimmering outline of a warrior standing at the far end of the chamber. I blinked, my throat too tight to speak. He wore ghostly war paint, and his eyes, dark voids of anguish, locked onto me. My entire body shook. I expected him to charge, to attack, but he just stood there, raising one hand in a gesture I interpreted as both warning and sorrow. A sudden wave of images flooded my mind, glimpses of a fierce battle in the canyon, shouts echoing, the thunder of hooves, blood staining the rocky ground, families scattering to escape the cavalry's onslaught. Then a raging flood that swept away the living and the dead alike. I could almost feel the weight of a child in the warrior's arms before the water ripped them apart. The pain that coursed through me wasn't my own, but it tore at my heart. I gasped, fighting tears. These were not just nightmares, they were memories, or an echo of them, burned into this place. Lightning flared again, and the figure vanished. My flashlight went out for good. I fumbled for my phone, using it as a dim light. The boulder at the entrance was massive, but I had to try moving enough debris to squeeze out. My eyes stung from the swirling dust. Each time I pushed or pulled at a rock, it threatened to shift the entire precarious pile. My arms trembled with the effort, and cold sweat dripped down my face. I don't know how long I struggled. The storm raged outside, water seeping in. The wind moaning like the canyon itself was mourning. When I finally made a gap big enough to wriggle through, I nearly wept with relief. I clawed my way outside into the cold rain. The canyon floor had become a muddy current, water rushing in small streams. Lightning revealed shapes racing along the cliffs, the pounding of hooves echoing once more. A terrifying thought seized me. Was it a phantom stampede? A moment later, a flashlight beam cut through the dark. Jake, you in here?" It was Carlos's voice. He'd come back, concerned after noticing I was gone so late. Behind him, I recognized the shape of Trisha, holding another flashlight. They must have tracked me by seeing my RV still empty. My heart leapt with gratitude. We half stumbled, half swam, through the rising water until we found safer ground. We took refuge behind a rock outcrop as the storm tapered off. My teeth chattered, partly from the cold, partly from shock. "I saw him," I said to Carlos, still panting. "A Comanche warrior. Or his spirit. I don't know how else to explain it." My voice cracked. Neither Carlos nor Tricia laughed. They looked deadly serious, as though they'd already suspected such things were real in these parts. When we finally navigated back to my RV, the sky was starting to lighten. My clothes were soaked, caked in mud. We huddled in the cramped interior as the wind died down outside. Tricia whispered about how her father used to say that if you ever encountered Running Thunder's spirit, you had to offer a gesture of respect, of peace, or the haunting would follow you. My teeth still chattered, but I realized she might be right. Perhaps that's what the warrior was showing me, the memory of a heartbreak so deep that it tethered him to this canyon. Carlos looked at me with genuine concern. "You have to go. Man, this place isn't going to let you rest." But a part of me refused. I felt responsible, like by witnessing those visions, I'd stepped into a story that needed resolution. I said I'd leave. But first I had to at least try to honor the dead. Whether it was superstition or spiritual truth, I no longer cared. I needed to do something. Donna appeared later that morning, worried about our well-being. She'd driven through the muddy roads to check on campers. I told her everything, expecting to be ridiculed. She didn't ridicule me. She took a quiet breath and admitted that there were diaries from early soldiers describing a warrior, possibly called Running Thunder, who lost his wife and child in a flash flood after a cavalry raid. Over time, local legend turned him into a ghost rider. "Some energies persist in places where tragedy occurred," she said. Then she gave me a small leather pouch containing dried sage. "Burn it. Say a prayer for the souls lost here. Even if it doesn't help them, it might help you find peace." Late that day, the storm clouds parted. Carlos and Tricia insisted on joining me for a final trek down the canyon floor. We found a spot near the collapsed cave where a shallow stream now flowed. The three of us built a modest rock cairn in memory of those who died. I sprinkled the sage around the rocks and we stood in silence. I wasn't sure what words to speak, so I just muttered something akin to, "I'm sorry for your loss. I wish you peace." The wind picked up, swirling the pungent scent of sage. For an instant, I could have sworn I saw that spectral horse and rider in the corner of my vision, watching from a ledge overhead. Then they vanished like a mirage in the heat. We stayed until dusk, half expecting another supernatural confrontation. But the canyon was quiet, aside from the usual rustle of wind through rock formations. No hooves, no wailing. A strange calm enveloped the area. I can't say if the spirit was truly laid to rest or if it simply chose not to appear. But I felt an enormous weight lift from my chest, as though I'd finally exhaled a breath I'd been holding since I first arrived. The next morning, I prepared to leave. My RV was muddy and dented, the battery once again lower than it should have been, but it started up with a sputter. Donna gave me a parting look that spoke of relief. Carlos said he'd come back in a few days to finish painting now that the storm had passed. Tricia told me she felt better too, though she'd be cautious about exploring alone. As for me, I decided I'd had enough of the canyon's secrets. Driving back up the steep road toward the canyon's rim, I glanced into the rearview mirror. The sun was rising, painting the layers of rock in brilliant shades of red and gold. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw a silhouette on horseback watching me from a distant bluff. A tall figure unmoving in the dawn light. I blinked and it was gone. Whether it was a trick of the eye or a final farewell, I'll never know. But as I crested the rim, I realized I felt different. Lighter, more alive. I had faced something ancient and terrifying, caught between tragedy and time, and I had not run away. I don't claim to have all the answers about what lurks in Palo Duro Canyon. Some might call it folklore, others might insist it's restless spirits trapped in an endless loop. All I can say is that the experience left me humbled. There is power in honoring the past, especially when it's riddled with grief and bloodshed. We like to think we can outrun history, but some events leave scars on the land itself, echoing across generations. I'm still looking for a new job, a new direction, but the fear that once paralyzed me has loosened its grip. If I can confront a ghost rider in a canyon, then maybe facing the uncertainties of the future isn't so daunting. Sometimes you have to confront the darkest echoes to find your own voice again. That's what I took away from Palo Duro Canyon. It's both a place of breathtaking beauty and profound sorrow, holding on to memories of lives ended and battles fought. In the end, maybe all we can do is bear witness, honor them, and move forward with deeper respect for nature, for history, and for the fragile balance that keeps us safe from the darker corners of our past. I still have trouble sleeping on stormy nights. I'll close my eyes and hear phantom hoofbeats, or that mournful whistle drifting on the wind. But instead of raw terror, there's a strange sadness, as if part of me aches for the warrior who loved so fiercely he couldn't let go, even in death. I whisper a quiet goodbye and hope he and his horse have finally found their rest among the canyon walls. And then I remind myself that life goes on. With every sunrise, we get another chance to find our path, to start over, or at least to keep walking forward. That, above all, is what I took home from that canyon. My name is Jake Riverson. I'm 34 years old, and I hope that by sharing this, I can give a small piece of closure to any who felt the lingering sorrow of that ancient place. I found something I never expected: the courage to keep going when the shadows grow long and the heart pounds with fear. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that facing the unknown can lead us to a strength we never knew we had. And sometimes all it takes is a whisper of compassion, a handful of sage, and the humility to know there are forces in this world far older and more powerful than we can ever fully understand.